Well, we'll let people in as they come in. Thanks for popping in the chat. It's so great to see everyone where you're coming from. Thanks so much for being here. And welcome everyone to School Garden Management 101. We're so glad you're here. My name is Russell. I am the Network and Training Manager at the Edible Schoolyard Project. And so excited to be joining you for this virtual workshop on school and garden management. And I will pass it over to Jess, who is going to facilitate our workshop today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Again, so glad to have you here. I am the garden manager here at our Edible Schoolyard site in Berkeley and being in school gardens and educational farms for over a decade. So really excited to get to share some thoughts about garden management with you today and also learn from y'all. We'll have some chance to kind of respond and interact a little bit. And I feel like this, if there's one thing that's constant across all gardens and all projects, there's just endless learning to be done. So excited to be here with you. And we got to get a little snapshot. Thank you so much to those who answered some of our pre-survey questions. So in addition to the chat telling us a little bit where people are coming from, we got a sense of the wide variety of gardens y'all have. So some of you are gardening in less than 500 square feet, all the way up to like 3 or 4 acres, which is amazing. Folks are growing in all types of ways. School gardens often have lots of raised beds, so we saw that, but lots of y'all are growing in the ground and in creative ways vertically or in containers. And folks are serving ages all across the board. Lots of folks on the younger end, which is awesome. It's such a special time to garden with young people. But like us, there's folks who serve middle school and high school as well here too. So I will try to speak kind of broadly in a way that can speak to all of these spaces. I've had the great privilege of gardening in multiple climates, multiple settings, everywhere from like a 1 4x8 raised bed that was supposed to serve a entire school to an acre here in Berkeley. So as I'm sharing information with y'all, I'm hoping to kind of share skills and techniques and ideas that can be applied across lots of scales there too. But mostly I'll be sharing techniques that we're using here at our garden site. It's about an acre of land. It's been managed by our nonprofit for coming right up on 30 years. So it's got its own unique kind of style and flavor that we work with here. We are going to try to take a few minutes now to give y'all a chance to introduce yourselves to a small group of three. There's enough people in the room and enough stuff to talk about that we can't do introductions for everyone to everyone, but there's just so much richness in the cross-pollination that comes from meeting other people who are doing this work that we'd love to have y'all. We're going to do a quick 3-minute breakout session where you'll be put with two other folks. And if you could take 1 minute each to share your name, again, just where you live and garden. Maybe that's important to share the city or the state or even the neighborhood. Maybe there's something unique about that neighborhood where you are. And then 3 or 4 sentences about your garden. Like, how big is it? What elements do you have? Who do you garden with or for? And what part of garden management are you really thinking about or puzzling over right now? So for me, as I mentioned, I'm Jess. I live and garden here in Berkeley, California. In this acre garden, we have chickens and bees and worms and also annual vegetables. You'll hear more about it in a moment. But the thing I'm puzzling a lot about is how to balance time spent thinking and planning versus just time really having my hands in the soil. I find it tough to balance that. So that's a quick model of what that could look or sound like. And please just try to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak in that 3 minutes of time. So Russell, I'll have you send everyone away into their groups of three.
Awesome. Everyone should have just received an invite, so feel free to accept the invite and we will come back in just about in 3 minutes. The timer says 15 minutes, but actually it'll be 3 minutes.
All right, I think we are having folks rejoin. We're just waiting for all of the folks to get sent back. Okay, I think sorry if folks got cut off, as I assume there's so much to talk about. You could have stayed and chatted with those folks for many minutes, but thanks for coming back. Now that you know a little bit about each other, I want to make sure you get a chance to just give a quick snapshot. this super overwhelming slide is a quick snapshot about our site context here. And just wanted to put out there, so, as you're hearing me talk today, you have a sense of like what we're focused. And these slides will all be available to y'all they're going to get sent out to you sometime later this week. So if any of the slides feel overwhelming, don't worry about kind of getting all the information. You can look back at it. But I did want to mention we're gardening on an acre that includes about 8,000 square feet of annual beds and also perennial beds, fruit trees, non-fruiting trees, chickens, a beehive. Forgot to even mention our worm bins. So all of that is part of what we're working with here. We have a teaching kitchen, which is a really beautiful tool for us to have our students really connect with food there. And then our program serves 1,000 middle school students. So that's school day classes, that's after school classes. We open our garden for recess, for more free engagement in the garden. We have clubs at lunch. We host volunteers here in a variety of different ways. And the space is actually open to the public during all non-school hours, so weekends and holidays. So all of that is happening. And as we're thinking about managing this space, we're trying to kind of keep in mind the broad scope of the kind of is trying to have. I'm going to speak more about our staffing later and how we get the work done, but here it feels like an important part of the snapshot. So I've also listed our staff here. We're 5 full-time employees here at this site. That doesn't include, we actually have support administrative staff that are located at another site. I myself am part-time, and we rely on AmeriCorps fellows, college interns, volunteers. So it's really a village that is caring for this garden. Our mission is to transform public education and support the values of nourishment, stewardship, and community. What that looks like here at our King program is we're really focused on expanding young people's food knowledge and their sense of belonging. So as a garden manager, as we're making decisions, I'm always kind of keeping that in the back of my mind. Like, what is our goal as a program, and how do our decisions impact that goal? All right, so that being said, that's our context. We're going to dive into today's agenda. I'm going to talk a bit about sort of big picture, what garden management is, and then, or at least to me, and then talk about some key areas within that before we have some time for questions at the end. And we'll start, and then I did want to mention that as I sort of briefly mentioned before, these resources, we are going to share a whole folder with you that will have lots of documents and resources that I mention here. So you're welcome to, if you hear me mention something, you're welcome to put into the chat, like, just mentioned a record keeping of seeding, like, please make sure that's in the folder, because I forget things all the time. So feel free to, if you note a resource that you really want to make sure is in there, it'll be a Google Drive folder that has lots of resources there. And if questions come up throughout our conversation today, feel free to pop them in the chat. I don't think we have time to like stop and answer each questions along the way, but Russell's going to be paying attention to the chat, and if he sees a question there, he's going to take a note for that, and then during our question and answer period, he'll be sure to kind of bring forward any questions that have come up throughout the presentation. All right, so today we're going to jump first into this big picture kind of overview of garden management. And it feels just important to say that the whole idea of garden management is this process of supporting, like, interacting with an ecosystem and guiding that ecosystem toward the outputs that you're really hoping to attain. And this, ecosystems are so complex. So this really requires an ever deepening understanding of each element of this ecosystem and how they're connected to one another. And so I had a few questions come through in the pre-survey that was kind of like, well, what does a garden manager even do? Or how can we think about this? So this is like a vision into my brain, but this is how I kind of understand the role. That I'm spending my time with taking in inputs. So there's like this foundational knowledge that I'm using and current conditions, and then I'm providing different products that should help the garden function better, and the team contribute to that garden functioning. So I'm relying on some things that I already know about how gardens grow. I'm constantly learning new things. I'm walking through the garden every day, but really intensively weekly, to really understand what the conditions are there. I'm meeting with folks to talk about what needs to happen in programs. I'm doing all that so that I can then create these site plans, these crop plans, task lists. And then I also am working in the garden, but it is surprisingly smaller amount of time that that active weeding or garden work is happening. So to give a sense, a little bit of like a week in the life, which is another kind of question that came through. This is if like, I haven't actually tracked my hours exactly, but this is my sense of how this time gets split. That I'm spending the majority observing the garden, purchasing supplies, coordinating volunteers, this awareness of current conditions, and also then planning, envisioning, creating daily action plans, so that we can really activate work in the garden, which is both myself, but also garden work parties and volunteers and interns that are doing garden work with us. If you are the only employee of your whole program, your split may look really different. You may be doing lots of active work in the garden and not really have as much time for planning and visioning. If you are full-time, whereas I'm part-time, you might have a higher active work in the garden role. And if you are new to gardening, and this is like the first time you've ever managed a garden, you might spend a lot more time in the foundational knowledge. Like I'm still looking at pest issues and things every day. I'm learning new things. But if you're really new to gardening, it would make sense to spend a lot more than just 10% of your time kind of setting that foundational knowledge, doing that research, that kind of thing. Yeah, so I'd love to, hopefully y'all have a way to reflect, whether it's just in your head or if you have a piece of paper and a pen, but would love to give you a moment to just reflect. Like when you think about these four areas and you're managing your garden space, which area would be the most impactful for you to deepen, develop skills, create better systems for, devote more time to? So yeah, knowing that you probably do a little bit of all of these, like which is the area where you're wanting to grow more in yourself, like and to expand and develop your skills in. And if you have time to reflect on it, you can think a little bit also about like, how could you give yourself more time to do that? Like, how can you find time in your days and weeks to get more of this side of things? And I'm just gonna let y'all reflect for a few more moments on this. Like, how does your act as your planning and visioning, how does that all break down? All right. Yeah, there'll be other moments for other reflections, and I recommend continuing to kind of reflect on your work all the time. But one other snapshot I wanted to give is that for us in our garden, how we move through the seasons, one of the questions that came up is really what does it look like across the seasons? And this list is really not comprehensive. This is just a kind of one way to look at what's happening summer, fall, winter and spring. And I haven't added these time frames, but I did want to just give a model of, I really recommend keeping a list like this, both for yourself, so that like when the season changes, you're not just trying to remember like, oh, right, order the garlic quick, like don't forget to do that, or don't forget to inventory the seeds. Like that's already just kind of on a list that you're glancing at. And then also just because, as we know that many of us might be working in schools or nonprofits where there is turnover. I mean, in all employment, there's often turnover. And when you create a list that looks something like this, probably longer with more details on it, you are really setting up the organization and the sustainability of the organization and the garden to be able to just have this institutional knowledge of what needs to happen each season. And it'll be unique to your site depending on what key elements you have. Great. So we're going to move into talking a little bit about some more of these garden foundations of what are the key things that really are foundational to the garden being successful. In general, I think of garden management as like this cascading series of decisions and priorities, and you're constantly making these decisions, and there's some foundational understandings around ecosystems and plant needs that will guide those decisions. So uh, ensure that plants have what they need in the right amounts at the right times, and that you're minimizing disruptions to plant health that might come in the form of disease or pests or weeds, any of that sort of competition for the resources that the plants need. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these slides because I assume that most folks in this room are gardeners or have some of this knowledge. But I do want to mention them because they really are the building blocks for all the management decisions that I make. And so I just want to like return to this kind of baseline space that I'm kind of drawing that information from. Sun and water are of course really essential to all plant health. Um, and the key thing I just want to say about sun is that like plants really need the amount of sun to grow that they need. So if you have a garden that has different sites, different parts of it that are full sun, part shade, full shade, or if you have a full shade garden, which lots of school gardens, folks are kind of like, cool, you can have that corner of the courtyard that gets no sun for your garden. And that can be really frustrating and challenging. And my key recommendation around sun is just it's best to grow lettuce and herbs really well versus like watching tomatoes struggle all season and never make fruit and sort of just limp along and stay alive but never really thrive. That's just the suggestion to like embrace what you have and work towards potentially changing your options, or maybe you can like have your school garden bed and then have a few pots that you're allowed to put out into the sunny area for a while so that you can grow tomatoes. Growing things in a way where you can have that success of like, oh, this plant grew and thrived. And that will also build support for your program as people see a beautiful head of lettuce come out versus sort of a struggling tomato plant not really doing anything. That's going to build engagement and commitment to the program as well. Along in the water area, I would just like my key recommendation is installing irrigation as soon as possible to save time and ensure consistent water delivery. Here at Edible Schoolyard, we have a combination of drip irrigation. We also do hand watering. We have some overhead sprinklers. I mean, that's been really helpful for us, but we put all of our irrigation on timers. It's a challenge for us, especially having a site that's open to the public. To put it on timers, we really need to put those timers like below ground and make sure that folks can't mess with them. So that's something we aspire to, and it still is a huge time drain on our team to just move hoses around to plug them into the irrigation. But as soon as you can kind of get an efficient irrigation system that's going to water your plants thoroughly and directly into the soil, that's just such a huge help for your garden. Soil. Okay, so soil has its own slide and it really could probably be its own entire presentation. Of course, it's a kind of a lifetime of learning about soil. Gardeners often talk about like growing soil and then letting the soil grow the plants and really thinking about like this is just this essential medium that our plants are growing in. For our plants. So it's both the medium it's growing in, it gives it like sort of that structure for plants to grow, but it's also their access to water and nutrients. And the structure of the soil will allow water to move in different ways. It will allow nutrients to be more or less available. And so really your understanding of soil is going to greatly impact your ability to put the right crops in the right places for them to thrive. And also your understanding will help you build a plan for how to have better soil over time. So my key recommendations around soil are to just really invest in understanding it. So that can look like soil testing. This guide, the picture of the Healthy Soils Activity Guide I have here, is a great resource. And it has 8 soil tests that students can do like in a day on site. And so it's like a great resource if you're wanting to analyze your soil, but you don't have the time or the money or the capacity to send it off to a lab. You can also get like quick rapid soil tests so that students can practice testing for pH and potassium and those things, which can be great and can give you a snapshot of your soil as well. And then you can also get more technical than that. So we send our soil samples. We strive to do it annually, but sometimes we're not able to do it that frequently. But we have 2 labs that were recommended to us this year. We're sending our soil to Oregon State. So it takes a bit of time for the soil samples to come back, sometimes as long as 2 months, but you can also do that for getting that soil tested. And then once you know more about your soil, you really want to make choices based on those soil conditions. So, like, what can survive and do well in clay soil versus sandy soil? And then just continually be looking toward how to improve your soil everywhere. Like, is that adding compost? It's often a really great way to increase organic matter, cover cropping, rotating crops between heavy and light feeders. We try to reduce our tillage here. There's lots of pros and cons to all of these decisions, but the soil is kind of a long years down the line. But it can be really beautiful to see how soil can evolve over time with good stewardship. All right, and then the other piece of this is around minimizing diseases, pests, weeds. The key thing, we in a school garden and sort of philosophically place a strong emphasis on avoiding chemical pesticides. We only use organic products, and even then we don't really do much treatment of crops here, partially because we want to avoid chemicals, partially because we don't have time or capacity to do much. So we rely a lot on catching infestations early. So a key recommendation I have in this is if at all possible, to at least once a week, do a walk through your space that where your only lens is looking for problems, for pests, disease, weeds overtaking a space, where you're not kind of stopping to be like, oh, actually, let me think about this other thing. Let me weed for a little bit. You're really spending a quiet moment looking for these things so you can intervene as soon as possible. We also try to follow a lot of the methods around integrated pest management or IPM, which have there's really great ideas around how we can use biological controls like predator insects, et cetera. And a really cool resource is there's resources through Wild Farm Alliance that I recommend if you want to dive deep into that world of encouraging beneficial insects in your garden. But I also want to point out that there's some unique opportunities if you're in an educational space where you're not on a strict stressful sort of deadline to deliver 100% healthy crops all the time at the end of the day. You can really use pests as a teaching tool. So you could put up signs that explains what's happening in the pest life cycle, or I've seen a great lesson where students observe, a pest issue in the garden, like maybe a cabbage moth caterpillar, and talking later about like, well, where should we intervene in that pest life cycle? And if we know it's later going to become a moth or a butterfly, like, do we want to intervene or do we want to let that later pollinator, go through its full life cycle and become a pollinator? So there can be cool ways to talk about pests and use them as an educational tool. And that can kind of help a little bit with the heartbreak of the crop loss that we sometimes see in this space. And then I feel like I would be remiss if I did not mention in this foundational section this idea of it takes people's hands in the soil. I mean, you can design a beautiful garden where the ecosystem mostly takes care of itself, but if you're really wanting some outputs from your garden, it takes a lot of hands. And often we're gardening in urban spaces where that ecosystem has been so disrupted that it takes a lot of time and energy to care for the land. And I'm going to talk more about sort of the people aspect of this at the end of the presentation, but I do want to just emphasize the idea of planning for a garden that you can care for. So avoiding getting too big too fast. And then the other piece is really making the labor visible. So whatever it takes to help the entire organization who you work for understand the real scope of what it takes to care for that land. So that might be tracking your time for a week and then extrapolating it, or tracking all the volunteers who come through, or building out a calendar, which I'll show you an example later, to really be able to document how much time and energy it takes. So we'll take another minute for a reflection. Would love to have y'all spend just a minute thinking about what aspect of the garden foundations do you feel most comfortable with? So when we look at the 5 little buckets that I put up here, and if I missed something that feels foundational to y'all, you can write that in for yourselves too. But yeah, and then what do you want to deepen your knowledge on? So take a moment to just sort of think, like, where do you feel most comfortable? Like, these decisions come easily to me. I can glance at a plant and have a sense of, the water or the soil issues. Where would you love more learning and deepening? And then please take an opportunity, if you have a resource that has been essential to you, as you learn about these foundational elements of the garden, like please share a resource if you have one that you think has been great. So for me, it's that Healthy Soils activity guide. That's the first thing that comes to mind of like, oh, this resource is so accessible and so useful in working with students. Um, but please add if you've got a resource in mind, a book, a website, something that you come back to when you're like, oh, right, I just need to like refresh myself on this thing about water, about soil, or sun and air, pests and disease. Feel free to add that to the chat. Oops. Cool. And we will, if folks have the ability to add a resource, that's great. And we will add them to the information that goes out that will include a list of resources that we both like here at the Double Schoolyard and that people are sharing in the chat as well. Okay, we are going to move on into the topic of garden design and redesign. So our garden here at the Edible Schoolyard, this is a pretty recently updated map. So this is pretty much what our garden looks like right now with a little bit of artistic kind of interpretation. But it's evolved so much over the last 30 years. Like sometimes I see pictures from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and it just like boggles my mind. The site was initially has been a part of the school's site for many decades. And we started gardening here 30 years ago. And at that point, it had been used as like a place for portable classrooms. It had been used as a parking lot. And it was pretty much an abandoned space that had many paved areas. And it wasn't being used for much. So in 30 years, it's been like a true labor of love with many, many people participating in terms of turning it into this really vibrant garden space. Lots of decisions have been made during that time. Some of them great. Some of them continue to be challenging. I'm sure I'm making some of those decisions now that will challenge future farmers. But I just really want to mention that like the design of a garden is a constant evolution. So we're making decisions all the time. And what you have right now, you might have like a small area you're hoping to make bigger. There might be ways that your current garden just like isn't serving your needs. Or maybe you are at the very beginning where you have a space that nothing has happened there and you're about to embark on this journey of designing a garden space. This conversation is both about design and redesign because it's just like a constant conversation. It's not like design, check, we're done, but we're constantly kind of continuing to design our garden space. So basically, no matter what stage you are in the process of your garden, I think it can be helpful to have a framework for how to sort of reflect about a design process. So these are some steps that I have found really helpful in just thinking about garden design. And they don't necessarily go in one particular order because there's different parts of it that happen, kind of continuously. But really important to consider your goals, like what is the impact you hope to have? Consider your site. Given the conditions, what is possible? To seek out historical information. How has this site been used before? Like, are there previous growers or farmers who can give you information? Socially, culturally, how is this space used 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? So you can really think about like sort of spiritually, what does your presence on this land mean as well? Gathering input from and community ideas is really essential. That could go first. Like you could really start there. And I think it's great for lots of folks to start there. You may want to have a sense of goals as well that you've been thinking about why you're even bringing it to the community. But really getting a sense of how do others hope to use this space and what concerns do they have? And then given lots of that information, that's when it's then kind of pulling on that to create a phased plan that starts small and allows for expansion. And then reflecting regularly, continuing to gather more feedback, find out more about the past, incorporate new ideas, kind of staying open to what you're learning each step of the way. So that first step was considering your goals, and at Edible Schoolyard, these are some of our key goals in our garden space. So when we look at our program and the impact we want to have for our students, this is kind of what we need the garden to do to be able to have that impact. We want to produce food and teach garden skills, academic concepts, social emotional learning. We need it to be a beautiful, welcoming space and also be able to kind of serve our non-school community. when you're thinking about goals, you may have a goal that applies to the whole space, or you might have sort of sections like, oh, this is the area where we're really thinking about food production. This is the area that's like more about social emotional. You may find that it applies differently across the site. Um, I think what's helpful in clarifying your goals is that there are always going to be trade-offs between multiple goals. So for instance, I made a table, and again, lots of information you can return to when you peruse the slides later. But I wanted to kind of draw out within each of our goals, a little bit what that goal means, and then some of the design recommendations for that goal. And to note that that often comes in conflict with another goal. So on one hand, for us, food production is really important. We try to have most, if not all, of our vegetable ingredients for our kitchen program come from our garden. And we have 1,000 students here who rotate through our kitchen. Um, and we also try to do giveaways to families and staff. And we are just trying to produce a lot of food. So to achieve this goal 100%, we would really need to like plant every inch of our garden with edible crops, and that would be one thing. But we also teach skills and academic concepts in the garden, and we want students to engage with the space. So we really need wide pathways. We've got middle schoolers. They're big. They're not always careful with their feet. That like we need them to be able to move through the space where we're not constantly like careful, 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 but they can feel at ease in the space. So we need to have wider pathways. We need lots of gathering spaces, to be able to break into small groups and have them move through the space. And so we are giving up some of our crop production space for a teaching friendly space. And this just brings up like a constant conversation with all of the members of our team, our teachers, our program staff, and myself to say like what's serving our program the most right now and what's not serving it. And we're in a constant evolution. Like right now, we really want to widen our pathways in a couple areas of our garden where we've just noticed, oh, this is really hard for the students to engage with. And we're willing to give up some amount of pounds of crops that, at the end of the year to be able to have that change. Yeah. And then as we kind of expand into thinking about like our social emotional learning and creating a welcoming and beautiful space, there's additional communication and trade-offs that happen to achieve those things. So what I would say is that these goals really change over time and can change depending on the constituency. The folks who this garden was designed for 30 years ago, Berkeley was a different place. Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School was a different place. Like we may need to change our goals depending on who we're working with, and really centering our constituents and our students and our young people in that conversation is really key. So we may say that actually the social emotional learning is the most essential thing we can give our students right now. Let's really focus on that in our garden and not worry so much about buying in some vegetables from the grocery store. So those conversations happen ongoing all the time. Yeah, so I would love to hear a bit from y'all. Like if you could take a moment to just reflect, and feel free to add to the chat as well. Like what are some of your garden site goals? Some guiding questions within that might be like, what do you need your garden to produce? What do you hope your users to experience while you're in your garden? What types of programming do you want to run in the space? And I put our 4 key. Also, there's this box for others because you might have totally different goals, and that's great. Yeah, so feel free to reflect on that and then add any into the chat as you're reflecting. I'll give us just a couple of moments to think about that. I'm seeing, yeah, that some people are saying that, yeah, like the social emotional experience, such an incredible opportunity to have this space where things are living, things are dying, animals and plants just evoke an access to some of the social emotional sides of our students that really may be hard to access in the rest of their experience of school. So I love seeing that in the chat. See SEL, which I think about as second social emotional learning. Yes. And then I was also thinking about, I think I saw something about English language learners, which is like a really cool goal that we do a little bit of and hope to do more of here in terms of creating a space that can be open to folks who are learning in different frameworks or in different languages, that kind of thing. Yeah, a place that all classes can use somehow. Yeah, we sometimes talk about like how do we model our program after the way libraries are designed, where like every class knows how to go to the library, sign up for time in the library, use that space. How do we kind of think about the access point for that? Cool. Thank you all for sharing these goals. Please feel free to keep popping them in the chat. It's really cool to see how much overlap there is too. Like if we had more time, I'd be like, okay, let's get into breakout groups with these by goals and have y'all talk with each other because I'm sure you have amazing resources to share. So maybe that can be like a part two sometime in the future. To jump back into, yeah, you can feel free to keep adding to the chat, but I'm going to jump back into kind of the design ideas around our design process. So there's the next step in that list is like opportunities and limitations considering your site. And this returns to these key plant health considerations. You know, given the physical and programmatic conditions, what can your site support? How much sun, water, soil do these plants need? We also always think about like how do we really engage the senses and spark curiosity? And I just encourage you all to think kind of beyond what's right in front of you in the moment, but like also how do other community members use this space or how do animals pass through this space? There's really cool guiding frameworks through from sort of permaculture design that can provide inspiration for deep analysis of the site. They do like a cool sector analysis, so it's worth kind of diving deep into that direction if you have an interest. There's full trainings on that type of design as well. All right, so we talked a little bit about the first two sections of this process, just as a reminder that there's areas that I recommend is like thinking about the historical side, the community input, creating a phased plan, reflecting. And I also wanted to just note that some of the key elements that have really served us well within our garden design. So it's a lot of areas. We are blessed with a big space and many areas that just feel like essential to the success of the space. Obviously, one constraint you may have is the size of your space. And so you may be choosing two things. And, you know, like I think that's just a beautiful thing to be offering to the students who you're working with. But this, yeah, this is our kind of general site and some of the key things that feel the most essential to us. I wanted to also note on the side that one of the things in general this opportunity is for, so these are like 5 things that we think about all the time and could be activated in different ways. So like activating the senses, awe and wonder, demonstrating cycles, tasting in the garden, digging in the dirt. Like these are some like core things that are just like so special if you can make sure that they happen in your garden, but it could happen a lot of different ways. Like in terms of awe and wonder, that might be like we have this beautiful iron tunnel that someone designed for us that our kids can walk through and like look up and see the sky in different shapes. But awe and wonder can also come from like one butterfly plant that hosts a monarch butterfly and then you get to see that whole life cycle. So that can be at really different scales. And for us, I'd love to hear from folks too, if you want to add to the chat, like what is a key design element in your garden that you love or just use all the time with your students or your students love, where you're just like, oh, if everything disappeared, I would keep the compost pile, or I would, it just, it's kind of fun to hear, like, what are these things that are essential for your program to succeed? And the two I would call out for our site, having animal habitat has just been like such an amazing resource. Chickens, they're expensive to keep, but we just keep like committing to that investment of feed and space. And because they're just so magical with students to watch kids interact with animals. But that could be chickens, or it's also our worms in our worm bin, or getting to observe our beehive. So that's been a really beautiful part of our program here. But right next to that is a very inexpensive, our compost piles are just such a foundational element of all of our lessons in terms of in the kitchen, the students bring the food scraps out to the compost pile. The students are part of building these piles. It's like we spend a lot of time in 6th grade, which is our first grade level here, really setting the foundation of how important this cycle of life is and the compost pile is to feeding the garden. So those are two of the areas that feel really key to us. I'm definitely seeing, like, I'm seeing other people that having like cut flowers, which is like such a beautiful thing. Like being able to allow students to take something home and give it to someone is such a wonderful way to provide some social emotional learning there. movable work tables is such a great idea. Like that might be just this key element that makes your space function is that you can transform your space regularly, which is great. Multiple language labels for signs is awesome. Shade. I'm so glad someone said that. Oh, Jenny. Hi, Jenny. I'm so glad you said that, Jenny, because I feel like teaching without shade can really be like, why are we even here? The students are so uncomfortable. Or that also might be like if people are wet or whatever it is. So like those gathering areas, those things that help people feel comfortable in the space. Awesome. So I just wanted to throw up a couple of the design resources that I find really useful or have found useful over time to share. A couple of them are specific to schoolyards and school gardens. And please feel free now if you have a resource that you have found really influential or interesting or impactful, please go ahead and share that in the chat too. Like what resource do you turn to when you're kind of racking your brain about how to make the next decision or trying to get ideas or what else you could add. This is an amazing book that this person traveled or Sharon Danks traveled all over the world and has just lots of pictures to peruse where of cool images of gardens all over the world that have musical elements or have slides to get up and down the hillside or cool ways to think about schoolyard spaces. Cool. Thank you to everyone who has shared any of those resources. And let's take a little moment to stretch. I don't know about y'all, but I find it really hard sometimes to sit still for very long, and I do that more than I like to in my job. So take just like 30 seconds or a minute to stop and stretch and take a breath. And yeah. All right. Let's folks get resettled. Again, one of the things I mentioned puzzling about a lot in my job is not getting to garden as much as I want to because I'm organizing so many things. So it's good to get that physical time in our day as well. Coming back to the agenda, we're going to move into this topic of crop planning. So there's lots of planning that goes into the garden, but I wanted to focus in on crop planning for a minute. And a crop plan, as y'all probably are aware, is the goal is to answer some key questions. So like what crops will we grow? Where will we plant them? When will we plant them? What will go in next? Um, and you can write a bunch of different forms. It can often be written in a map or a table or a spreadsheet. And it usually can have kind of two elements to it. So it's like the actual what's going to go where is more maybe of a map type thing. And then also like when you're going to plant it, it might be more of like a seeding schedule or like a table in that kind of form. For me, I've tried lots of different things. The thing that I find the most useful to me in terms of like putting things down on paper is to have like a big whiteboard map. So that's what's on the screen here is I'll have like a big map where the actual map is drawn in a non-erase marker and then I can change and update what's in each bed. I find it really helpful in terms of talking with the team and in terms of like being able to plan phases. So I use different colors for different like seasons turning over into other seasons. So a whiteboard map and kind of like as big as you have space for is something that I really recommend as a visual kind of as someone who visualizes space better in a map form. I update this about 2 times a year, sometimes 3 if the seasons get a little wonky on me, but I'll like update it in fall for the winter spring transition. That's what this is a picture of, like kind of thinking about we're pulling at our summer crops, what's going to be in here for the duration of the winter and into the beginning of spring. And then in late spring for the summer fall transition. I've also sometimes experimented with doing this in like a Google Sheets, being able to kind of look at each month as a column happen next in the bed. And one thing that's nice about this is it can serve as a historical record. So you can then look back years and like months and months and even years in that same bed. So if the bed is B1, I can see like, oh, it's lettuce now, but last fall it was this or last. And so if you're trying to rotate, keep track of what's rotating and what's a heavy feeder or a light feeder, or might be host of disease or pests and wanting to rotate your crops, having some sort of historical record can be really nice. And digitally is usually easier for quick reference. Sometimes I'll do that in like just once a year and then kind of update it ongoing throughout the year. It's a little clunkier for me than just writing it out on a whiteboard, but I do appreciate the historical knowledge. And then the other side of this is then a seeding list. So like looking at each month, what's the crop, what's the variety, how many plants like would go into, like how many beds of that do we need? Like, and so then what are we going to start in the greenhouse? Like, oh, we're going to start 3 128s in early January of broccoli. This may or may not be the way you're working or the like level of detail that you're looking at. But for us, as we start seedlings for a whole acre of space, and we also share seedlings with other sites, and we also run a plant sale in the spring, it is really helpful to have a really detailed list, like month by month, day by day, that just is a reminder of like what to start when. Because once the season really gets churning, it's hard to like be like, oh right, we need to start like 3 days of broccoli in mid-February so that they'll be ready by March. Like I find I need like maybe 3 or 4 days of like really pouring through date by date, crop by crop, like what we're gonna seed. And then as you're kind of like thinking about these things, some of the key reflection questions that I'm asking is, what crops will suit our lessons or our programming? So I talk a lot with our teaching staff around what they're hoping to grow, like use in classes. Again, limitations, like what do we have space for, sun for? What is our season? What are our seasons like in this climate zone? What are our aesthetic expectations? How comfortable is the principal of our school or the leader of your organization with plants that get a little messy or might get aphids or might get powdery mildew versus other plants? Do you have the capacity to cook? So like if not, it maybe you're giving away a lot of your crops, but also maybe you can focus on more fresh eating stuff, like things that kids can pick right there and then and eat, and just really give a lot of space to those ones as opposed to, hard skinned winter squash. Like maybe you want to focus on things that are more fresh eating. A big trade-off question that I often ask is like, do we want a lot of one thing or small amounts of lots of things? So do we want students to like see a variety where like they're like, ah, I saw broccoli grow, I saw carrots grow, I saw tomatoes grow. Like I really get what can grow in a garden. Or do we want to be able to bring like 10 classes of 30 students out to the garden and have everyone harvest a carrot for their class? Because that's like an essential experience we want everyone to have, is to harvest a fresh carrot and eat it right then. And there's not really a value judgment either way, but it is hard to do both. There's sort of trade-offs within each. Or it's hard to do both for everything. So you might be like, we need tons of carrots. We're going to grow a little bit of broccoli, a little bit of cabbage, a little bit of, and then we'll just supplement. If we need more for our recipes, we'll buy more cabbages at the grocery store because they take up a lot of space. They take a long time. We struggle to grow them well in our conditions, whatever those things are. And then the other question, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next slide, is just whether you need to adhere to specific timing, like I need this cabbage to be ready on March 3rd for this class, or whether you can like flow and respond to the garden more. So that comes to this idea of approaches to making a crop plan. So as you're thinking through what am I going to plant where and when, I think of it as kind of like two different options here. Like you can again think like, all right, we need to grow lettuce for our salad lesson, which is going to be classes flowing throughout March. We're going to have all of these classes cycling throughout the entire month of March to grow lettuce. So we need it to be ready March 1st through March 30th. It takes 50 or 60 days to grow that lettuce. So like it's in the winter, so it's like slower and a little bit unpredictable, ongoing. So then it's like, let's do a succession. So we're going to sow one tray of lettuce every 2 weeks in the greenhouse from December through February, the early February, in the hopes that that will allow us to have that amount of lettuce ready. And then I might like location wise with something like a lettuce, I might be like, okay, well, we're like one bed, B1 is going to be our lettuce bed. But then as the successions come out, I'm just going to make a decision on the fly because we can plant them next to things and with other things. And we're going to kind of interplant the rest of the lettuce. So that might be one example of working backwards toward a date. And always trying to like give some wiggle room. Like it says 50 to 60 days, but like it might be 30 and it might be 80 depending on your particular set location. So it's good to kind of think that through. The other option, which is like way less complex and can be great if your program works for this, is to just grow a variety of plants that suit the season. And then you're just like looking at a planting guide, what's good to plant this time of year, and selecting plants that really meet the key criteria of your garden, and then thinking about what your students might enjoy, et cetera. And then when they come ready, just running your program in response to the plants. So we do both of these things here. We do things like the lettuce that I just gave an example of, but also I had a conversation today with the teacher about all of the green tomatoes that are in our garden, and they're going to make tomato chutney next Monday in their food processing class. So, and that's just a response to lots of green tomatoes in the garden. So both things happen here, and it's just like two different ways to go about it. And either way, there's so many times that things don't go according to plan. So I would say with either one of these approaches, there's this sense of flexibility that's really essential to this process. And as much as you can like train that in or practice that in or encourage that into the entire team of folks who you're working with around like, yes, that was the plan, but this is what happened. How can we adjust? Like, how can we like use this as a teaching lesson to show that gosh, man, it's like really hard to control gardens. And we thought we were going to have a lot of cabbage and we don't. Let's talk about that with the students. We could maybe buy in cabbage to like do this lesson, or we can say like, instead of cabbage, can we use fava greens, which we just happen to have out here, and then really make that visible for the students in terms of what it means to eat seasonally and respond to the realities of the farm. Because so many of our students and so many of our fellow community members, just you go to the grocery store and it's just always there. Everything's there. And you don't know what decisions were made on the other side of it, like how far that produce had to travel and in what conditions and what chemicals were had to be used to ensure that perfect head of lettuce was always ready for you. And so it's kind of a great thing to talk about with our students when things don't go to plan, really like not trying to cover that up necessarily, but demonstrate that and think creatively with them. And that's a great social emotional skill too. How do we let it go and move on and be creative problem solvers? These are just a quick couple, like a couple other lists of things to kind of keep in mind. Some key concepts. Days till maturity obviously is a really key thing when you're thinking about timing. We do a lot of intercropping and companion planting. The idea of sort of squeeze crops, like what can we plant along season crop like broccoli? Can we just like throw in a little couple rows of bok choy that'll be in and out quickly? We can use more space. We can water just one bed instead of three beds if they're all kind of growing well together. And we have such intense weed pressure here that it is helpful for us to try to really put a lot of food into small spaces so that we can then keep track of those spaces well. And then some helpful tools that I found helpful in the past. One of those is like a regionally based garden book, and I would really recommend the one that's great for this region is the Golden Gate Gardening book. There's probably other ones for the Bay Area too that are great. But these are some of the resources that I really find help or have found helpful, and it's just great to have your go-to resources. So the Urban Bounty, unfortunately, I think is out of print, but it was like a really straightforward, like basics book about like how to do everything in a garden. It was nice to just reference for like a quick reminder of things. This Gardening by the Moon calendar has like a really cool sort of snapshots month by month, and it's they create different versions for long, medium, and short growing seasons. So you can look regionally for your area and order like a calendar that relates to your area. So again, call for resources that we will then distribute. If anyone has a crop planning resource that you have used in the past, and that is such a like that these resources have been valuable to you, it'd be great if you have a regional garden guide that's awesome for Atlanta, Georgia. Like we would love to collect all that and put it into a document that we'll share out with y'all at the end of this week, by the end of the week. Cool. So feel free to keep mentioning those things as we're thinking, if you have any resources or as we're going. But I'm gonna jump in to our next section here. So this next section is around maintenance systems in the garden. Kind of how do we keep these gardens going, given that they're complicated and complex and there's people involved in them. when I think about systems in general, I often think about it's sort of creating good systems as a way to make the endless list of tasks more manageable and efficient. So how do you kind of deal with a space with so much going on? Ideally, systems help to kind of break that down into manageable pieces. So I think I kind of think about it in three different areas, but there's probably other ways to organize this conceptually, but that we have infrastructure systems, some delegation and communication systems, and then record keeping systems. Those are some of the systems I'm going to share today. Um, in terms of infrastructure, irrigation, I already talked about how great it is to irrigate as soon as possible. But we also, use a hand water list to support new plantings as we go. And with signage, we kind of rely on three different types of signs in our garden. Some more decorative signage, some more like informational signage, like with the bed label and what's in there. And on the back of those ones, it says the date it was planted, and that's more for like our and then for everyone to identify what's in the bed. And then we'll have like larger informational signs that give little tidbits of information throughout the garden as well. We update both our watering lists and our signage regularly. So we walk the garden and kind of like check through those things each week. Tool systems, obviously so important to keep things organized. This is an old picture of our tool shed, but it is still our tool shed. Still looks a lot like that. And we just have different systems of organizing things that have been helpful for us. Keeping gloves, in a way where students can easily grab them and put them back has been great. And nice to have our tools be able to kind of come out of the tool shed so students can engage with them outside of the space. All of the sort of systems you're seeing here were supported by volunteers. So we had parent volunteers who helped to kind of build these things over time over the last 30 years. So it's been an ongoing evolution. I would say that the supply systems become even ever more important with more people involved. So if you have a lot of volunteers, you have a lot of like interns or folks who are moving through the space, it's great to have systems that people can flow into so that things don't get messy and kind of lost or broken easily. I also think it's just such a good modeling for students of how we take care of our things and how we're careful with things that we use in the garden. Delegation and communication systems, because we have so many people who work together in this garden, this has been a really essential sort of system for us to build out. We have a lot of folks who are working, like sometimes it's like teachers have 30 minutes between class to do some gardening, or it might be, like regular volunteers who come in, but their start time is sometimes different each day, and they need to sort of be able to access information quickly. So one of the ways that we do that is with a big garden task board. This is a picture of ours a couple weeks ago. It's evolved a lot over time, but I update it every 2 weeks, right before our garden team meeting, so that they can like then provide input and we can talk about it. We use a Slack channel to be able to provide input to garden tasks, and that's been really useful to us. I don't know if your organization uses Slack, but being able to have a space where people can give a quick note and it keeps all those notes together when they walk by something, like, oh, like is it time to thin the apples, like just throwing that into a Slack channel, so then we can like organize that information into a collective space. That's been a really helpful virtual tool for us. It's been important to like prioritize, and then we have one space kind of up at the top left where it's like days. Sorry, guys, just dropped the book, but everything's fine. It's having a place where people can like take a quick glance at the board and be like, okay, well, if I don't have time to like think through this, or I don't know enough about the garden to make a decision, but today's highest priority task is to weed L5, like I can go do that. So having a space where there's a highest priority task is also really valuable in this. Yeah, and so ideally when a regular volunteer or a fellow has been trained, they can actually choose tasks from this board independently. And like, I only put things on this board that I feel comfortable with someone else walking away with the information that's on the board and making decisions on their own. We also have a fairly complex, this is the first time I've worked somewhere with this complex of a sort of system around this. So I don't think this is possible everywhere, but I'm going to mention it because it is how we function here. We are really blessed with having a team of 6 AmeriCorps fellows this year, which is new for us. We have not had that in the past, or in the recent past. It probably has happened in previous iterations of Edible Schoolyard. But we have created a transferable job wheel. It's of all of our transferable garden responsibilities. And I do think that this model is possible at different scales. So if basically we've taken the time to kind of break down some of the regular repeated tasks that just every single week we're getting done, and then written a job description or a standard operating procedure description for each of those tasks, and then trained someone up to do that task regularly. And then that means that I'm no longer doing that task. In our model, we rotate that, so each person does it for a month. It could be there could be benefits to not rotating it, but we have such a value around learning and exposure that we want our fellows and interns to get exposure to all these different areas. So you'll see a list here of all the things that we have put into those categories, like compost, data entry, pests. Those are all of those sort of job wheel tasks. And then watering is also rotates through people, where one person each week waters every Monday, and that just stays the same throughout the year. Like we have one person who's the Monday waterer for the whole year, and they grab the hand watering list and water off of that list, which I update weekly. So within these tasks, I gave a template on the left and then an example of our weeds and pest task. We have laid out for folks like what is the daily responsibility of this task, what needs to happen Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, what could happen any day but needs to happen at some point that week, and any like how-tos or explanations about that task. So they're fairly detailed, but have been really liberating in terms of really putting on paper, like this is what needs to get done every week. And this is like kind of the time frame when it gets done. And then we had our fellows actually help us to put this all into a calendar space. Again, you may or may not have the need or the desire to kind of go this deep into a system here. But for us, it's been helpful for a couple of reasons. It means that we have everything that gets done regularly in the garden on this calendar. We can see who's doing it. And also when people are going to be out, they can easily hand off that task. So if we go to the cafeteria every day and pick up compost, and if we don't do that, it really like messes up the system. The cafeteria gets confused. They send us emails. It gets wonky. So that's one of those tasks that we really want to make sure, even if that person is going to be absent, that someone else is going to do it for them. And having it on the calendar is a really helpful way to make sure things get handed off, don't get forgotten, and anyone can kind of see who's doing what. But the other thing I will say about this is it's been very helpful in terms of making the labor visible. So it's really helpful for us to look at the calendar and kind of see like there's just a lot that gets done. And then it helps us also reflect on that. Like, is this good? Is this a good use of our time to plug in the irrigation, that takes us like 6 hours a week? Or can we make the case for $500 investment in irrigation timers and watering boxes, because it really is taking us a long time. And it's like that the hours add up. So again, this is not necessarily something that everyone needs to do, but it has been really helpful to us in terms of really understanding the scope of what it takes to care for our garden. Record keeping is another important part of our work. So we keep track of everything that gets planted, everything that gets harvested, all of the student visits to the garden. So that might be a class visit, or it might be individuals during the lunch and recess time. Like we track those numbers, all of the volunteer hours, like to both the number of volunteers who come and also the number of total person hours that are contributed. And we also use, we have a Slack channel where we like any reflections we have about the garden for our records, we use that. So we'll say like, the timing for the peas was awesome this year. Let's do the timing the same next year. Like we'll just throw that into a Slack reflection channel. And then when we're doing kind of our reflection at the end of each season, we have that recorded. We can just go back to that Slack channel and say like, oh, cool, you're right. That was a good choice. Or like powdery mildew was just insane on the cucumbers this year. Like make sure we have a plan to address that ahead of time. Those kinds of things go into the Slack channel that we use as a reflection process. So we will share, I would guess many of you have similar systems, but we will share record keeping systems in that folder. And so you're welcome to borrow ours and make, copy them and make them your own if they work for you as well. So these are just two examples of some of those ways that we're keeping those records. We Also, I just wanted to at least spend a moment talking about supplies. So finding the supplies for school gardens is like a notorious challenge, right? Because usually there's very little funding and you're really trying to scrap together the things you need. I just wanted to mention a few of the key resources we have or places that we go for supplies. So there's a couple seed companies um, that will donate seeds for little or no cost. So it's great to reach out to them in the fall and request those seed donations. You can often get wood chips for free from local arborists, coffee grounds and coffee chaff for your compost pile or for other nitrogen needing crops. Cardboard is usually available. You can just find like a furniture store. They usually have a bin of it. If you use that we sometimes use that for suppressing weeds. Food scraps. We are lucky to have a large school cafeteria that produces a lot. We've also in the past gotten them from grocery compost dumpsters. If you have composting systems in your city, most grocery stores will have a compost dumpster. And then if you have a space that's large enough to accommodate corporate volunteer groups, they often are able to bring supplies or donate a certain amount of money. And I just like really recommend always asking that question. So when folks want to come and help out, and they're especially if they're part of a corporate group, it's often great to say like, hey, we'd love to have you. Is there any way y'all can pay for the tools and materials for the time? And they might say no, and then you can decide whether it's still worth your time and energy to host them because maybe you just need hands more than anything, and that's great. But often they'll be like, great, yeah, we could throw $100 at that, or we've had groups bring even several $100s worth of supply money with them, so that's worth thinking about. And then also just asking local nurseries can often give a discount, or any other business can often give a nonprofit discount or a school discount, teacher discount. And then ordering in bulk is also really helpful to reduce costs. Awesome. We just have a couple more slides before questions, but I did want to mention someone asked in the pre-survey about school breaks, which is just such a challenge about school gardening. So often even you may not get paid for summer break, or there may not be any humans who are paid to take care of the garden at all. And especially during breaks, this can be really hard. So we puzzle over this a bit as well. I am year round, so that does help in terms of our system. But we have also relied a lot on neighborhood volunteers. So we post signs on our gates. And for instance, this winter break, we have a local volunteer who's going to come and care for our chickens. And she's going to be in town all break, and she lives walking distance to the garden. So that's a really essential tool for our chicken care. In the past, that's been a student who has particularly loved chickens, and she and her father came and got trained on how to care for the chickens over Thanksgiving break last year. We sometimes have interns or work study students through a college who are seeking additional hours. So like maybe their finals period was really stressful, but they are going to be in town for the break. And so we can kind of get them some extra hours and train them to be here. And in the summer program, both here and in other places, it's worth asking around. In your city has like a youth job training program. Sometimes it's possible to host that youth core at school gardens and like merge those two goals of getting young people out in a paid job and then getting the gardens taken care of. I've seen that happen a couple of times. So there's probably also lots of other great ways that folks are being creative around this, but this is some of the ways that we deal with garden care over breaks. Which brings us to volunteers, because that's so much for us right now at our site with our staffing level. It is really, really essential for us to have volunteers support the garden. A part of that is because we do want to teach our students lots of concepts, and we sometimes will spend the day talking about concept and not get as much gardening done. And it frees us, having volunteers to support frees us up to say like it's okay to have the students come for an hour and do a cool like interactive the yarn lesson where they're talking about how ecosystems are interconnected. Like they don't just have to be working the garden the whole time. And they do continually do garden work, but volunteers are essentially part of the team as well. So I put the list of our staffing back up here as well to just give you a sense of in this piece. In the parentheses are the hours that this person is kind of focused on the garden. So for me, it's my entire job, which is 25 to 30 hours a week, is focused on the garden. But for our program staff, that could be like between 2 and 10 hours a week, depending on the season. For each of our fellows, that might be between 3 or 20 hours a week, depending on how much they're teaching. Nature, of course, hopefully we're planting a garden where nature is doing a lot of that work. And I really encourage like diving into the permaculture concepts that help us think about like how do we plant a garden that actually doesn't need as many hands there because we're creating healthy ecosystems. But right now, our acre of land, we are averaging about 40 hours a week of volunteer support. So that's like when we took all of the volunteer hours that we got for the whole year and divided it by 52. So, that's like you can take that number as you will. It doesn't account for breaks or those kinds of things. It averages out to about 40 hours a week. And that's a lot of people because there's not just one person coming for 40 hours, but lots of people coming for a few hours here and there. We've tried to consolidate all that input into some regular repeated times. So first Saturday of the month, we have a drop-in work party that we usually get between 30 and 40 people to those, which has been wonderful. Once a week on Tuesday, we have a small group. We're limited to just 10 slots, but just a small group of folks come. You can sign up online to join us for Tuesday volunteer hours. We do allow regular volunteers who want to commit to at least 2 months of work with us, that they can then work with me to set up a different time. If Tuesday doesn't work for them, they can come and I'll set up okay, Monday mornings at 10, I'll meet you and get you set up. If you can, it's worth our time to train that person and kind of work with their schedule if they're going to commit to at least a couple months. That's included this amazing pair of individuals who are helping us prune our trees. We have 100 trees on site that need pruning every year, and they come, a couple hours a week for the entire pruning season, which has been just an essential way that we've gotten our trees pruned the last couple of years. And then we do in the summer, we open up a few positions for often it's like college students, but anyone can apply who have some time in the summer and want to commit to more like 20 hours a week. They receive more in-depth training, and they also get to choose like a project area in an area of interest so that it can kind of contribute to their goals and their learning as well. And I think this is a lot of coordination to have all these volunteers on site, and it doesn't really fit neatly into any of our job descriptions. So it's been a bit of a learning curve for us to figure out how to incorporate all these volunteers. But what I will say has been essential to that is to really both to see the impact of the volunteers, but to really see the volunteers as one of our constituencies. Our students are still our primary constituency. So we are really thinking about what serves the students best. And I really see a lot of impact in the people who come through the space. Like we live in a highly urban environment. There are some folks who don't really have any access to a green space to build a relationship with and to kind of feel a sense of commitment to. That all is just like an important thing in terms of when it becomes hard to coordinate volunteers. That's one of the things that feels valuable is the sense of like gardens can serve multiple people in multiple ways, and can really be worth all that investment. The way we find those people, it can be different for everyone. I will just note that the biggest sort of game changer for us has been being a part of Hands-On Bay Area. They have like an online calendar, and you may not have hands-on. They do have hands-on in other states, but you may not have them, but you may have, I'm forgetting what the one was in Massachusetts, but there are often these sort of like volunteer placement organizations that have a calendar, and you can put your volunteer day on there, and then they find the volunteers and send them all the information, and then you just get to see how many people are signed up, and then they show up. So that's been really just game changing for us. But we also try to make sure that we have information hanging on our gates, on our websites that can recruit folks. We've reached out directly to colleges and universities to ask relevant professors to share with their classes. We have a food systems minor at University of Berkeley here that has been a great source for us. Parents coming through is wonderful, AmeriCorps folks. So all like reaching out directly to like garden clubs or master gardeners or, high schools to see if there's like community service projects can all be a great source of finding folks. And when we do have those folks here on site, we try to really give them, make it a good experience. Try to have a variety of tasks folks can choose between. Nothing that's so precious that like if they mess it up, we're like, oh, that's so like that they can sense a feeling of having like done something wrong, and want to really like work at a level that feels comfortable for folks who are just joining the garden for the first time. And then as you get to know them more, you can kind of help them give them tasks that might have more higher stakes. And then one thing that's great for us is we currently can host a lot of people because we can sometimes divide them into many tasks, and we have fellows here who can lead those tasks. But before that was true for us, what we would do if we had a lot of people is we'd find one area where 30 people could get started on this big hillside that we can never control or contain. And then I would like take a group of five to go do it, like set them up with a smaller task, and then another group of five over here. And so kind of moving around, that was one way that we managed it with fewer people. I kind of already spoke to why people come back in, into this space. And this is kind of what we've heard from our volunteers, that it's not just the gardening and the learning, but it's also like a connection to living things, or really the only time in their week that they get to chat with people. Their job is really isolating, or they're retired and they don't have a sense of community, or they just moved here. So trying to highlight those things in their experience can be really successful in building a continuous volunteer group. That brings us to the questions. So Russell, I'll let me know. I know we have like maybe almost 10 minutes, 8 or 9 minutes to throw some questions out there. And then I think we can also think about like making a list of questions and responding to them in the docs that we share if we don't get to everything.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Jess. So I captured some questions from folks as they entered them into the chat, and let's see. I posted them in our agenda doc just below the agenda grid if you have
Do
access
you mind
to.
just reading one aloud? I don't think I
Yeah.
can access that easily.
Yeah. So one participant asked, can you tell us more about the cooking kit that you use?
Yeah. Let's see. We do have our kitchen, but when we cook in the garden, that kit can involve anything from we like to have running water if possible. So we do have a faucet. If you didn't, you can sometimes when we are like further away from those spaces, we'll have just a bowl of water where folks can like do a quick rinse for something. Um, and then we usually have like cutting boards with age appropriate knives or scissors, depending on what your age group and your like skill level is. Butter knives can cut a lot of things, but don't cut skin very easily. So that can be a great solution. Or scissors, or just using hands to like rip things up. And then like a little butane burner or little like stove can be great if folks feel comfortable using that. If you are gonna like make, for instance, like quick pickles where you're gonna like boil the water, put them in hot vinegar. You might want to just be able to boil those together. Or if you're gonna process herbs or process something, yeah, and then I think, like it can involve like a set of measuring cups, like if you're making salad dressing, so you can do the whole, you could have like a set of bowls, a set of measuring cups, a couple jars, a couple utensils, and then it can be like everyone just cutting up herbs, putting them in a jar, measuring oil and vinegar, shaking that up, and making a beautiful salad. So I think it can be fairly simple. But also if anyone has great links to cooking kits that they use in the garden, please feel free to pop that in the chat and we can add that to the resource document too.
Awesome. So then another question is, how do people deal with the knowledge needed for fruit tree pruning? It's expensive to have done professionally, so wondering if you have relationships with volunteers in the community or other ideas.
Yeah, this is a great question. We do have volunteers who prune our trees with, like our staff does have a decent amount of knowledge in this area, but it is very time consuming to prune trees. Like I think for us, the limitation is the time. I'll share a link that we have to kind of a basic overview of pruning. Um, but what was really helpful for us was to connect to a local backyard growers group. So it's sort of like a master gardeners group, Alameda Backyard Growers. They have a whole team of folks who are really into pruning. We had them come to our site to host a workshop where they taught, like they ran it. They were just looking for some citrus trees to be able to do this workshop. So then we connected with them. They pruned a tree for us during that workshop, but then we also kind of put out the like the heads up that we were looking for folks who want to do more pruning, and they helped us find a couple of like intermediate pruners who we felt comfortable being like, yes, like that's a skill level we feel comfortable kind of like leading our pruning with. They're learning as they go, but they're very careful. They use a lot of resources. We did a walkthrough with like a master gardener pruner initially with them who was willing to donate a couple hours of her time to help us kind of build a pruning list. And then they've guided us through the rest of that time.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. So then the next question is, what do you make your bed/crop label signage with?
Oh, I'll put a link to a couple of things in our resources. We've landed on these little metal signs that I order off of Amazon, although I don't like to admit it. I wish I could find it from a different source, but that are great because they come with these pens where you can write in the rain, and you can update them pretty easily. So those little metal ones, I'll put a link to it in our resources. And then I feel like signage is a constant odyssey, but there was a time when we had funding to get um, artwork that the students made printed on metal signs. If we could still pay to do that, that was one of the examples that I showed was of lettuce that was done that way, and it's beautiful and it lasts a really long time, and it doesn't have the sort of same concerns around paint chips in the garden. So that's great if you have the funding for that. We also do paint on wood and try and just use like low toxic paint, and then just commit to repainting every couple of years and doing that as a project with students.
Thanks, Jess. So, um, those were all the questions that I recorded,
Great.
and I do notice that we are coming up on time at 4:30 Pacific time. So I think unless there's any other questions that po folks want to put on the chat, this might be a good place to wrap up.
Great. Yeah. Please feel free if anyone has like a last question. But otherwise, thanks so much for joining us. We'll make sure to like bring together any resources folks dropped in there, and I think you'll get an email from Russell sometime later this week with those resources. Please feel free to come by anytime. We're open to the public, so you don't even have to let me know if you're coming on a weekend. But it'd be wonderful to connect with y'all if you're ever in the area, and yeah, keep an eye out for other opportunities, other training opportunities. We hope to get to meet y'all in person one day. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Jess.
Yeah, my pleasure.